everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm the CEO and co-founder with Impetus Digital. If you're not familiar with Impetus, we offer numerous cutting-edge asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools and services for everything from virtual advisory boards, co-author working groups, medical education, internal corporate meetings, and everything in between. At Impetus, we really believe that all great ideas start with a conversation. Our online collaboration platform is the perfect place to not only start these conversations, but also for continuously building on the ideas and insights that are generated over time and that help to create authentic relationships with the participants in the process. So having these big, hairy, audacious conversations is how we can start to implement change and positively disrupt healthcare in the way we know it today. So with all of that said, the idea behind this webinar series is that we want to start the conversation around some of these more controversial, more provocative ideas, and to discuss the opportunities and issues in the healthcare industry that it's facing today, along with how technology can help. So I'm really, we're always excited to have some of the digital entrepreneurs, the thought leaders, the provocateurs, and I'm happy to have one of those people with us today. And that is, I'd like to introduce Chad Walsh. Chad Walsh has enjoyed a very rich and varied career. He actually began his career in the nonprofit sector, actually. He operated a children's charity. He also worked in government and public policy for over a decade. He served as an executive director to the Premier of Ontario. He was also a senior advisor to a national party leader, and he is also a health tech entrepreneur and an investor in digital health. Currently, Chad is the CEO of a company called Sciteline. It's a decentralized clinical trial software firm that's based in Toronto. So in that capacity, he is working to drive an industry shift towards decentralized clinical trials. So no small feat for sure. So welcome, Chad. So happy to have you on the show.
Thanks, Natalie. Really happy to be here.
What an interesting career. We don't oftentimes get people who started off in the nonprofit sector or who's worked in government, who then goes off and starts a whole tech career as an investor and as a leader. So tell us a little bit about the trajectory and how you landed in the spot that you're in today.
Well, I think I should start by saying it's probably better to be lucky than good. And I've been very lucky in my career to have a bunch of different experiences that's led me to this point. You know, the charitable organization I worked for was actually a summer camp. It was an overnight summer camp. And it actually brought up kids with a bunch of different conditions from places like Sick Kids Hospital here in Toronto and other places. That was kind of my earliest exposure to different types of diseases and conditions that people are living with and kind of what that means for their everyday lives. I even have a memory of a clinical trial ongoing for sickle cell anemia while the summer camp was going on and kids having to shuttle back and forth to Sick Kids for the purposes of the trial. So I think back on that now, but I would be lying if I said that kind of led me to where I am today. I spent 10 years in government and policy and on the regulatory side. And so I really got a chance to see the impact of the healthcare system on people's lives. And more than that, in the last few years I was there, I got to see kind of the strength and innovation of the health tech sector here in Canada. And I knew after working with that group for a while that when I left government, that's what I wanted to do. And so we started Sciteline in 2018 as kind of a combination of patient monitoring and clinical trial work. And it's really accelerated in the last year or so, as you can imagine.
I bet. So tell us a little bit about what the premise is behind Sciteline. What is its core objectives and what does it do?
Yeah, so as you said in your kind introduction, we're trying to accelerate a trend towards decentralized clinical trials, but our focus while we do that really is on the patient. We know that one of the biggest impediments in clinical research is retaining patients, finding patients, and really engaging them in a meaningful way. And so we want to start at the point of designing our software and working with clients and patients in a way that really lessens the burden on patients, increases the engagement, and gives them the tools to participate in in clinical research in more of a democratized fashion.
Yeah, in a beautiful way. So let's actually just sort of do a comparison and contrast. So there's the world before COVID, and we're approaching the 1-year anniversary for this. And then there's the world during, and then, kind of post-COVID. I don't think we're kind of there yet, but you know what I'm saying. Tell us what it was looking like with Sciteline. What were you doing? What were some of the challenges at the time? And what has happened since the pandemic has evolved?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say, Natalie, prior to COVID, virtual trial, decentralized trial was certainly a thing that existed. And you can see lots of examples, probably back as far as 2011, when Pfizer did their kind of somewhat famous in the industry anyway, remote trial. That was really the first time we saw a big trial pushing the boundaries of this kind of work. And that was all the way back in 2011. Now, one of the reasons that failed was that the folks that they were recruiting for the trial were really an older category of people due to the condition they were studying. I think it was overactive bladder. And so they had recruitment issues and technology issues, but that was kind of the first time we saw that. Fast forward to 2018, and the FDA released guidelines on using some of this technology. And so it was really in kind of 2017, 18 that you saw the supply of these kinds of technologies increase, but the demand really never caught up until COVID-19. And I think there were lots of barriers pre-COVID, Natalie. Some of them kind of, at a high level with existing regulations, risk-averse corporate cultures, and things like that. And then COVID hit, and I think a lot of people moved towards this kind of technology for trials for risk mitigation purposes. So I think, people needed a way to access patients remotely, and it was a risk mitigation strategy that we think is slowly turning into an innovation one.
So let's actually just tease it apart, because there's two components to that. There's the risk mitigation, and like you said, there's the innovation component of it. Let's talk a little bit about what companies were doing prior to sort of more of a centralized version of trials. What is the historical way that clinical trials were conducted? What does that world look like, and what was involved?
I think the biggest thing to know, Natalie, is that a clinical trial is almost always associated with a physical research site. So a hospital or a clinic, and the normal cadence of a trial is that at the beginning of a clinical trial, you have to go in physically in person a lot to, screen, enroll, register, consent yourself into the trial. All of those are traditionally in-person activities in a trial. And then, if an average trial lasts 2 or 3 years, over time, an individual can expect to travel back multiple times to that clinical trial site for different assessments and interventions related to the endpoints of the trial. And so the story really is of in-person visits and physical locations. And what you saw pre-COVID was really high dropout rates in patients. So somewhere around 40 or 50% of people who originally sign up for a clinical trial don't actually finish it. And you saw a real difficulty recruiting people to clinical trials in that traditional model. Why is that? Well, if you have to go to a physical site, you have to be close enough to drive to that physical site. And so, if you are living in a rural or remote community, your access to these things was and still is probably much lower. And so we saw issues with recruitment and retention. And probably your listeners know very well, at least anecdotally, that the cost of developing drugs has been increasing year over year at a really high rate. And so clinical trials were kind of plodding along, kind of wanting for some type of digital disruption, I would say. But, because of the risk-averse culture, because of the fear of kind of near-term costs, because of regulatory barriers, it just wasn't moving in that direction. And so I think at Sciteline, we probably saw a 5 or 10 year horizon to get where we've gotten in the last year. So it's been a really big year for this kind of work, and my guess is 2021 will probably be a bigger one.
So the physical location has been obviously a huge impediment. I think even in the traditional way before COVID, only certain people were being, I guess, almost self-selected, or in some ways there was almost intrinsic bias based on where people were geographically located. And now that we're in this place where you can literally be anywhere. So when we talk about risk mitigation for people who are considering opening their trials in this way, so besides the geographical issue around people not being able to physically get to an institution, or not being able to allow, clinical research organization representatives come to people's homes or whatever because of lockdowns, is there any other risks that companies are considering mitigating by using a software like yourselves?
Yeah, I think there's there's probably a whole bunch, Natalie. I think the ones that really stick out to me are the potential that this kind of technology has to enhance both safety and compliance in trials. So, lots of times trials have issues with people completing assessments and questionnaires and daily diaries. A traditional one story I heard a couple times is people often travel into a site and they drop off a physical diary that they've been keeping day over day to track some of the progress that they're having. And researchers would see people in their car kind of writing out weeks and weeks worth of diaries just before they go in for their physical appointment. So we see the implementation of technology as one way that people start to follow the protocol of a trial more. They fill out things when they're supposed to. And it's a higher level of data that people then have in their trial. And so I think kind of compliance is a big one. And I think safety is maybe a less intuitive one, because a lot of people tend to think that, well, of course, the safest thing would be to be in person. But, I think that's not always the case, especially, Natalie, when it comes to reporting things like adverse events or serious adverse events. And I'm going down a bit of a clinical trial rabbit hole here, but most trials try to track a really serious event that might happen in the course of the trial. And I think the idea that you can do that in real time, that you can give someone access to technology that lets them report it in real time and alerts a research team in real time, actually has the possibility to enhance safety going forward if we do it in the right way.
Yeah, it sounds brilliant. I mean, obviously there's just so many check boxes here. It's hard to believe, but again, it is part of change management and shifting the big Titanic ship in a completely different direction. So it certainly takes time. So one of the things also has to do with who companies, clinical trials are targeting. In the traditional way, who was the target audience for the people that were going into these trials? And has that changed today based on the fact that literally the universe is open to the clinical trial that you have? So who are the targets now for companies?
I think this technology, especially in the last year or so, Natalie, has really kind of opened the doors and windows around who can access a trial and who sponsors are looking at to be able to access a trial. I think if we step back, we're living in a world where people are more aware of clinical trials and clinical research than ever before. The fact that people are turning on the news every day and seeing Pfizer's COVID vaccine, Moderna's COVID vaccine, and the rollout of that, they can see the value of clinical trials and clinical research. So one thing we've seen is just a general increase in awareness around clinical trials, which I think has kind of increased the population of people who would then participate. And I would say the biggest difference is slowly this idea that people who live outside of big metropolitan areas and are maybe from different socioeconomic backgrounds have access to this kind of research now. There's one great example of a trial that happened in the UK recently, where they were 67% faster in recruiting patients to one virtual site than 28 physical sites combined. And those 28 physical sites were all kind of major hospitals in cities. And the virtual site was drawing from a much bigger pool of people. So we see kind of the overall pool growing. It's been pretty limited previously, and we think this is kind of a big change, Natalie.
It could potentially be a gigantic explosion. But one of the things that we talk about, besides regulatory, which we're going to dive into in a few minutes, but it's really around change management. It's around workflow. It's around the habits and the belief systems that we've created as individuals and the legacy infrastructure that we've all built around us to make this, these gigantic, what I call systems thinking, or, these hubs work the way they work. And then suddenly, just like a Jenga block, if you pull one out, it potentially has the entire thing fall apart, which is, I guess, part of everybody's fear-based beliefs. One of the potential fears has to do with the reinvention or the reimagination of what an investigator is, or what they do, or how they get compensated, or potentially entire delivery systems, like what is the meaning or the use or the utility of a CRO or a contract research organization. What does Sciteline have to say about what the future of those dynamics are going to be?
It's a great question, Natalie. You've hit on one key thing, which is we work in a really big ecosystem, right? We aren't kind of the sole accelerator of this technology. As to your point, it takes sponsors, CROs, patient groups, all kind of looking in a different direction. And I think it's gonna take time. I mean, the first thing I would say, Natalie, is before we reimagine some of the bigger stuff you're talking about, I think we need to talk about trial design. One of the hardest things I think that's happening in the short term is people are trying to fit some of these technologies into traditional designs, as opposed to reimagining what endpoints might look like. For example, if you had an endpoint that required a 6-minute walk test as a part of your trial, and the protocol suggested that people had to drive into the site, walk for 6 minutes, and you're able to capture that, is there other ways that we could design that endpoint to be able to capture it in other ways? People often jump straight to wearable technology or things like that. But I think in the short term, Natalie, what we see is people looking at different options. Yes, there's a physical site option, but there's also often a nurse visiting your home as an option. There is potentially a family member being trained to be a part of this process before you get all the way to that technology. And so I think part of this is following the patient. I think if we start at the point of following the patient and realizing that patients probably don't necessarily want a fully decentralized experience in all cases. In a lot of cases, they may want a hybrid solution. I mean, that's what you see in most other industries and most other people's kind of lived experiences, to your point, is either optionality or a hybrid experience. And I think, we have to your earliest point, we have to follow the regulators as a starting point. But I think after that, it's incumbent for us collectively to push towards what is possible. And that is, oftentimes a technology solution, but it's also just reimagining how we design these things, who we engage in the processes, and what the overall trial might look like.
So you mentioned something really important there, Chad, and one of them was really just starting from the very, very beginning, which is trial design. Now, trial designs, typically in the usual pharmaceutical modality are these big global trials that are set up from a global division, and then they're out, they determine the affiliates or the various investigators worldwide. They end up using global endpoints that pertain to certain markets and not to others. And, and that's kind of traditionally how it's done. And the other piece to that, besides, it being globally determined, with a very specific type of target audience or target countries for basically approval dates, et cetera, it's not often done in concert with the patient in mind. So I guess the question for you is we look at trial design, besides endpoints, what else is going to change in this new frontier that we're facing?
Well, I think it's in some ways it's hard to know. I mean, we see trends happening in other parts of healthcare that are going to help in clinical trial design. I think the biggest one probably is just the massive uptake in telehealth and the use of telehealth across so many jurisdictions. And if you look at somewhere like China, prior to COVID, there was no national policy around telemedicine. And now, since COVID, the national plan covers telehealth. And I think that's true in a whole bunch of US states. And so I think we're going to see other technology in other parts of healthcare kind of pushing ahead of some stuff that happens in clinical trials, and it's going to help everything else that we're doing. I think there are other things we can imagine happening in clinical trial design. You hear people talk about master protocols. You'll hear people talk about, in some cases, pop-up sites or mobile sites that allow an even greater kind of diversity of participation. And so I think, you'll see that type of stuff, and you'll see, as we kind of alluded to earlier, a big increase in wearable technology and in data collection, kind of in real world scenarios, as opposed to just the ways we're inputting them now.
Are we going to start to see patients, depending on the dynamics of the condition, et cetera, being able to help determine what the outcomes or the endpoints are for a clinical trial? For example, if there's a large cohort in a trial that are big Peloton users, as an example, could there be this ambient biometric sensors built into the bike that people wouldn't even have to enter anything manually, and that somehow it seamlessly delivers into the system? Are these the kinds of things that we're going to start to see as uber customizations, precision developments based on consumer or health consumer needs and their inputs into what is this trial going to look like?
I think what you're describing is probably the ideal case, at least from a patient input perspective. I do think that it's really important to try, and it's kind of what underpins what we do, to really try and get a sense of what endpoints will work for patients, and to be able to design a trial that works for patients. I mean, you don't need to look any further than one of the earliest stats I threw out, which was somewhere close to 40 or 50% of people drop out of a clinical trial. Well, technology can only do so much, and the other types of work Sciteline does can only do so much if the trial isn't designed in a way that a patient is going to be able to be kind of engaged in a way that they feel comfortable with. It's easy to say that just has to do with driving to a physical site, but I think, you're kind of peeling back a layer that says it's potentially a lot more than that. And if we have technologies that are kind of less invasive ways of collecting that data, I think that's going to be a huge area of growth in research going forward. The Peloton is a great example. I think there's somewhere on clinicaltrials.gov, which is a repository of all the clinical trials happening. There's something like 1,500 active or completed trials that have used some kind of wearable technology like you're describing. So it's certainly heading in that direction, although certainly not in a ubiquitous way yet. But I think I would go back to one thing I said earlier, which is I think the short and medium term likely scenario for trials is a hybrid design. I think, when you read about this stuff at a high level, people just assume that you're trying to move everything virtually or remotely. And I think the experience of most patients and participants that I've talked to is what they're trying to find is a hybrid solution. Do you need to go into a clinic to consent into a trial? Maybe not. Are you more comfortable going in to a clinic for a blood draw than having someone come to your home? Maybe. So I think it's incumbent on us to work with patients to find that fit in the short term. And then I think in the longer term, you're exactly right. We could imagine being siteless. We could imagine having technology that basically captures all necessary data with very little involvement from the patient from an inputting perspective. I think that's likely. But it's early days, and I think that might be a bit longer term.
So let's actually just start from the very beginning, when we're trying to get to patients to discover and learn about what clinical trials are available. Could you see the day, just like we have pill pharmacies, right? So you have physical locations, and now they're remote, where basically pills or chemicals are delivered to patients' homes, and that's what's prescribed by their physician or their prescriber. We're now getting into a place where there's software as a medical device, and eventually we're going to see these digital pharmacies. Could we see the day that there's also going to be, in addition to the chemical or digital apps, that there could be physicians that prescribe clinical trials as a type of therapeutic? Is that on the horizon, and what could that look like?
It's a really interesting question, Natalie. I think that's very likely. I think there's a few things to think about as we head in that direction. The first is one of the most consistent data points we get back from participants who are involved in or interested in clinical research is that they want to hear about these options from their primary care doctor. So most people either want to or do hear from their primary care doctor around what kind of treatments are available in terms of trials. It's only kind of moving in the direction of online recruitment and different forms of recruitment in the last little while. I think in order to get where you're suggesting, which I think is in many ways an ideal state, because what you're suggesting implies a level of coordination in the health system in terms of available treatments that really doesn't exist now. I mean, my experience pre-COVID was, we're here in Toronto, you could be at one hospital in downtown Toronto and your doctor wouldn't be aware that in North Toronto there was a trial that you'd be eligible for. So I think in order to get there, we need to find ways to really communicate a lot more as an industry and to coordinate some of that effort. But I think when we get to that point, and when people start to see clinical research and clinical trials as an option in terms of treatment and in terms of the best way forward for them, I think hearing from their doctor or signing up through their doctor as a treatment is exactly where we need to go. But I think in order to get there, and one thing we've seen through COVID is we're getting a lot better, a lot faster at coordinating these type of things and working together. I think there are 3,000 COVID trials registered now globally. Well, that's just incredible speed that those trials have gotten up and running. And so I think the industry is starting to move towards a more patient-centric, strategic thinking and rapid learning phase, which I would not have said it was in 2019. And so I think all the things you're describing are very likely and probably possible now much earlier than they would have been had it not been for COVID-19.
So we'll have to cross our fingers in hopes that one day we will see almost like a clinical trial pharmacy where, these things can be relegated to people universally. And that's going to be the interesting question.
Or at least some place we could all go to see all the trials that are available now, even.
And to do a search, right? It would be like a Google search. Maybe, you never know, Google might set up a new search engine that's called clinical trials, and you use tags and words and things, and just like they have for Google Shopping, and you'd be able to find clinical trials. You never know, they might be working on that today.
Yeah, very likely. Yeah, or after they hear this conversation, they probably will start working.
So what is happening today? I mean, right now we had talked about traditionally patients have gone into their healthcare provider or whoever they've been referred to see about a clinical trial, and they have to go through reviewing of oodles and oodles of very detailed pages that are legal speak and nobody understands them, but they sign them anyway, or that it just becomes so convoluted and discouraging that they just walk away. What is Sciteline doing around the whole patient consent, patient acknowledgement, understanding of what they're signing up for? What are you doing to streamline that process?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've deployed the most during COVID-19, I would say, is the ability for people to consent electronically into a trial. So, like we've been saying, you start with kind of applicable regulations and privacy directives, and you need to make sure you're compliant in all those ways. But once you get past those barriers, I think the bigger barrier has been questions like, is this approach less rigorous than it would have been otherwise? And can we imagine a participant getting the same level of understanding around what this trial is and what it means through the consent process online versus in person? And so we've been pushing our electronic consent solution into a bunch of scenarios. And I think one of the ways that we've found kind of and this is what I was saying about a hybrid solution before, is a lot of times we'll send a read-only version to a participant, they'll read it, and then they'll schedule a conversation like you and I are having to really go over it in person, over video. I mean, not in person, virtually, and then they'll sign it after that. So I think there's lots of little solutions as we think about this, where we kind of have to meet people halfway. The idea, I think, of like a DocuSign type model, I think, is very appealing and in some cases appropriate, because you're able to record on the back end from like an audit trail perspective the person's interaction with that. But I think not all REBs or IRBs are comfortable with that approach. And so in some cases, we're finding, pairing that with video and having them talk through the consent process still allows everybody to stay at home and reduces that in-person visit, but creates a bit more comfort that, yes, they do have this understanding, and that kind of that standard of care is still what it would have been if you were in person.
Do you see a day where there would be a clinical trial on exactly what you're talking about, which is the variation of e-consent processes? For example, there's the traditional, which is the oodles and oodles of papers that are written and discussed in person, versus what you're suggesting. And maybe there could be one or two other arms in that study. One of them could potentially be a really scaled down, really fun, inventive, immersive experience of a document. For example, a series of video vignettes or an immersive experience using AR and VR. And then the whole process explained in a very whimsical, interesting virtual methodology. And then with really with really specific questions, somehow finding out the level of comprehension and understanding, be able to study that. Do you see that ever happening? And if not, is there regulatory concerns for some reason?
Yeah. So I think that is another great idea, Natalie. Hopefully someone's also listening and stealing that idea. But
that's what we do here at Impetus.
Yeah. I think that's probably exactly right. We need to push the boundaries of how we can do this virtually. And some of the examples you're giving, I've heard from other thought leaders, things like gamification of the consent process and the ability to kind of, in an immersive environment or a VR environment, to be able to better kind of get that level of understanding. Frankly, we find some resistance to just our current version of eConsent. And so I think there are some institutional and some regulatory barriers to that. But I think we're slowly getting to the point where you can see people starting to experiment and push the boundaries of that. I think we actually have a small experiment happening right now, which is during COVID, a lot of studies have had to switch from paper-based processes to digital processes. And there's enough examples of trials that have been able to continue. And so they've actually switched from one to the other. And all of those trials are going to have fascinating data sets. They're going to actually show us in kind of real scenarios what the difference between one and the other is. So another kind of benefit of COVID, and I don't want to say that there's only been benefits, but one of the benefits of COVID to this industry has been, I think we're going to see some of that kind of experimental data that we probably wouldn't have seen otherwise. You probably couldn't have even imagined the number of trials that have done this, doing something like that in a controlled way. So I think there's going to be really fascinating stuff out of this when we're able to get some of those data sets back and see, and hopefully that will kind of confirm some of the stuff that you and I are talking about, and then allow people to push the boundaries of that beyond that.
What is some of your gut reaction? Of course, we have to do a good, solid retrospective evaluation and study on all of what we just discussed. But if you were to hazard a guess on the impact that this decentralization and this, digitization, if you will, of the whole process, patient monitoring, patient portals, patient reported outcomes will have on things like trial reach and engagement, metrics like clinical trial efficiency or trial costs or expenses. What would you hazard would be some of the outputs on that?
I would say, my prediction is that we're going to look back and see this as kind of the moment that clinical trials got faster to do, cheaper to do, and were democratized in a way that really opened it up to a much larger set of the population. And I think you can already see the impact some of this technology is having. Clinical trials have seen in 2020 an increase from, I think it was about 25% of trials were using a telehealth portion or a telehealth technology. And now somewhere around 75% say they're going to use one going forward as a part of their design. And so things like that are, seismic in terms of the impact on the industry. And I think, as I said earlier, I don't, obviously people didn't wake up, one day to the next in March of 2020 and decide it was time to disrupt an industry. It was kind of put on the industry, and they really truly came to it for risk mitigation. But I think in just the last almost year, people have really moved from the idea that it's a risk mitigation strategy to the idea that it's where the industry is and needs to move. I mean, you see, we keep kind of touching on the regulatory stuff. What I think is really more interesting, Natalie, is all of the non-regulatory initiatives that you've seen in the last year. Notably there's a decentralized trial research alliance that is formed in the US, which is essentially all of the largest pharma companies, all of the largest CROs, all of the biggest patient groups, and all of them are advocating essentially a version of what you and I are talking about. Now, they're not kind of going as far as some of the AI stuff, at this point, but I think they are pushing us in this direction. And if we can have the regulators kind of move in the same direction, I think it's going to be just the biggest change probably the industry has ever seen.
Absolutely. I know a big player in this space in the US is somebody named Craig Lipset. He does tons and tons of work in this area. So I'm a big follower of his as well. So one of the things that, of course, always comes up, it rears its head at all angles. It certainly came up with COVID-19, the vaccinations, the rapid testing, the contact tracing, and everything in between has always come down to data, privacy, security, sharing, what's ownership versus shared. And this is going to be an ongoing dialogue from a regulatory, legal standpoint for many years to come, until we can get really comfortable with what data sharing means in the new normal. Do you have any thoughts on what privacy means from post-pandemic?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, from a clinical research and clinical trial perspective, as we've said, we're still bound by what in some ways are some kind of outdated regulations and some outdated views on this stuff. The FDA and Health Canada and other regulators, to their credit, moved really quickly to kind of temporarily allow a lot of these solutions in to the space. And I think that that has created a scenario where in the last year, people have felt like we're really moving in the right direction. But I think the biggest risk to us moving more aggressively in this direction is exactly what you're describing. And that's that we're going to fall back on a bunch of the traditional ways of thinking about privacy and traditional ways of thinking about how we regulate these things, for all the best reasons, in an effort to be as rigorous as possible, in an effort to kind of stick with what we know as safe and transparent processes. But I think if we really want to move quickly in the direction we're talking about, we're going to have to first make sure that a lot of these regulations that have come into place are made permanent. That's going to have a big impact, I think, on people's ability to do this in the longer term and make calculations from both a business and a patient perspective that this is the direction they want to move in. And then I think, and I know I keep saying it, I think we have to go back to the patients and what they want. And I think people's views of privacy are changing. People's views of what they're willing to share are changing. And I think, we'll follow the regulations, but we know that if we really want to do the types of interventions and have the technology that we're talking about, if we want to pull people's information off their Pelotons in a research context, we're going to have to really rethink some of the ways that that we look at privacy and data ownership. I think at the end of the day, the data is the patient's data. And if we kind of orient ourselves that way, we'll be heading in the right direction.
The thing that I think is a really interesting concept that rides along that is when we start adding all of this data into these data lakes, eventually to become data oceans, there's going to be a lot of people who will want to grab and mine it, process it, refine it, and use it in a myriad of ways. Especially as we start to think about the future of this ambient, seamless delivery of our human biometrics that's going to happen through talking to Siri or to Alexa on our smart units at home. Our television potentially might actually have software recognition software installed one day. Our keyboards are going to absorb the intensity of our fingerprinting and what have you. Could we see a day where we can see the average consumer will get paid through some sort of blockchain technology and assessment of who's used what of your data, that you would get paid for this information? Is this a potential democratization, if you will, or payments to patients, consumers, health consumers, to be able to make money on the data that they're sharing?
I think so, Natalie. I mean, I think that would be a really positive step towards freeing up a bunch of hugely useful data that people have and that they're collecting every day. I mean, when you think about some of the questions we're asking in research and in certain clinical trials, it would be so much more helpful to be able to collect that data in a real world, kind of in the wild scenario, as opposed to in some of the constrained ways that we do now in research. It's not always, I don't think, representative of how people live their lives, and therefore, I think being able to collect that real world data and being able to incentivize people and pay them for it just creates a much more sustainable, stronger model over the long term. I would say that that if we could head in that direction, I think the impact on clinical research would be hugely significant, and we probably would see a lot of the other things that you're talking about take shape, because people's data would be democratized in a way that would allow trials to capture it as well. So I think that's kind of the direction we should all aim for. And I think that's the direction a lot of this stuff is heading as we're talking now.
It's a really fascinating, limitless number of possibilities of what this can look like. I find this an incredibly exciting space. And one of the things I think that people feel fearful of is of the individualization, which is, oh my God, they're looking at me. Like, again, this is all part of the ego, and it's all about me, and they're looking at my data and my situation. It's like me. And I think really at the end of the day, the discussion is about population health management. It's just sort of like, it's one of many within these specific parameters, and it's a very different way to look at it. But it's still, I think regulations are really concerned about the individual disclosure. Now, when we think about population health and we think about the involvement of insurance companies as an example, we always realize that at the end of the day, complex systems, and we talk about systems innovation, that at the end of the day, those systems are perpetuated in one way or the other through incentivization of human behavior. And that's always a lot of times through money flow. So, and not always necessarily money flow, but incentivization. So when we think about insurance companies getting involved and we talk about population mechanics and the sort of very complicated infrastructure of health, is there an opportunity for all of these players to come to the table and to be able to incentivize behavior modification through incentives? I mean, how do you see various players, specifically insurance companies, being able to manage populations that way?
I think it probably would just be a much more honest assessment, as you say, of people's incentives and how we can better manage those to kind of our own greater good. I think, there are so many barriers in our current health system in terms of how it speaks to each other and how people value certain interactions and the kind of the ways in which people interact with all those different entities. I think it gets very complicated very quickly, Natalie. And I would say probably having insurance companies at the table is critically important, probably maybe even more so in the US than it is here in Canada, in terms of getting a better sense of population health and therefore incenting people. But my experience has been that the pace of that type of change is even slower than trying to get some of this technology into clinical trials. Our ability to kind of bring people together in the healthcare system, have them all sharing data, having them all kind of row in the same direction with the same incentives is a big hill to climb. I think the more we see successes around population health management, for example, the current vaccine rollout and people's knowledge of kind of all the work that went into that and our ability to kind of collaborate and share from that perspective, I think all of these things help us realize that we're so interconnected and that we're only going to get where we need to get by having everyone at the table. I think it's all pointing us in the same direction, but we have to be very careful in a post-COVID world, I think, to remember what this coming together has done for us and how it's helped us move so quickly, because I think there is a chance that we backslide into kind of more traditional ways of doing things and traditional ways of thinking. And the questions you're asking and the direction that you're pushing, even this conversation, needs to be happening in governments and with regulators and with insurance companies. And, I think that has the possibility of happening because of the world we live in now. But I think, if we're not vigilant and if we're not trying to always have these conversations, we could just move back to where we were before.
Absolutely. It is so easy to do that. I have a really provocative question. I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on this. We've always had traditional medicine as an example. We can just talk about chemical entities for right now instead of digital apps. And they've had outputs, they've had efficacy biomarkers and endpoints and results based on the cohorts that they've been able to traditionally use, based on key investigator sites that have always had great worldwide reputations, et cetera. Now we're going to be in an opportunity potentially where we can have global intervention and participation with people of all walks of life and people who may not necessarily have been able to be entered in these trials historically. Could we find ourselves in an interesting predicament where the outcomes or the efficacy results may not be up to par to what these traditional trials have shown, not because the products are not efficacious, but because of the participants that are involved? Maybe it might be much more inclusionary, might have different kinds of parameters that there might not have been in the earlier, maybe potentially biased trials. Is that a possibility, or do you just see that it's just going to make more rapid trial results and they'll be comparable in terms of the results?
Yeah. I don't think what we're talking about here is a panacea in terms of drug development. I don't think that we have every answer in terms of how to create, efficacious drugs that are, representative of the population. But I think this is we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good in this scenario. I mean, I think the ability of this technology to reach more people, especially in kind of underserved parts of the world where they have a much bigger disease burden than we have. And, there are so many people there eligible for some of the studies we're talking about. I think the benefits likely outweigh some of the risks that you're talking about. But I do think that it's really important that we are conscious of those things as we move forward, and that we're doing this for all the right reasons. As I said earlier, we don't want to, have decentralized clinical trials for the sake of having them, or because, we have this technology, so let's apply it. But I think what we're trying to do is, better find people in their lives and where they live their lives and have them participate in clinical research. And that might be, a rural community outside of Toronto here in Canada. That might be someone in the global community in another country who can then participate in research. And, what comes out, the outcomes out of that and the quality of the data that we have that comes out of that and some of the endpoints, I think, will be a work in progress. But I think, if you and I are talking about this 20 years from now, I think there is going to be some ups and downs, and we'll land in a place where we have much stronger drug development pipelines, and that the cost of drug development and the availability of these treatments for patients is hugely democratized. And so I think it's heading in the right direction. Are there going to be pitfalls along the way? Are there going to be times where we think, whoa, maybe we shouldn't have done that this way, or we should have gone a bit slower? I think that's true of so much technology adoption. And I think we just have to be vigilant, and again, keep the patients in mind and what's best for them. And I think the way that we've been doing it locally and globally just frankly hasn't been working. And so let's find new ways to do it and just do the best we can with people's safety in mind.
A final question for you to close up the session is, could you see the day where there is a cohort of patients with similar conditions, characteristics that have found each other on some sort of patient platforms who come together to design their own clinical trial and then crowdsource who the manufacturer, the investigator, the clinical study organizations are that are going to source and manage it? What's your thoughts on that?
I think that, so I think my short answer is yes. I think, though, my longer answer is we would all be so well served if things like that started to happen. I think, even people with similar conditions have trouble reaching each other. We don't have enough patient registries. We don't have enough consolidation of a lot of that information online. So, the future scenario that you're talking about, I think, would probably have, by necessity, had those people having ways to communicate with each other in better ways than they do now. And so I think even that would be a big positive. And I think if they're involved in design and if they're involved in some of these conversations, I think so much the positive. I mean, I think depending on when in the future that is, there still probably would be, regulatory issues to deal with, but hopefully we can start to get to a place where we let people imagine some of these things. We let people kind of in the tent to talk about how we design these things, and we move in the direction of patient-centric design in trials. And I think that's what you're describing. And from my perspective, the further that goes, the better.
I mean, there's so many things and so many legs to that. You could have those same cohorts designing their own insurance based on their risk factors and things. So you're going to see that potentially in the future as well. But I mean, ultimately, we didn't get to this, but there's a whole discourse on real world evidence. There's a whole discourse on how do we utilize things like patient registries as part of that data bank, and how do we leverage this so that trials can be faster, they can be more resilient, they can be more efficient, drugs can be built and discovered, or not just drugs, but other sort of therapeutics digitally otherwise can come into the market faster and with more rapidity. So lots more on the banks there, but exciting stuff for Sciteline for sure. I think it's exciting to be at the forefront of this really at the wave, being a pioneer in what this is going to look like. So for anybody who's interested in speaking with Chad, either to partner, to discuss further about what they might want to do with their clinical trials, to create either the hybrid or a digital version, we will be leaving his contact information in the show notes. So please be on the lookout when those become available. We also encourage you to check out our website at impetusdigital.com. If you are interested with this discussion at all, this is exactly the type of thing that we do with our asynchronous and synchronous virtual communications. We actually bring people like Chad and other interested stakeholders into virtual rooms, or through forums and a series of touch points to discuss this stuff. How are we going to change guidelines? How are we going to get regulatory teams and, globally and nationally to change position statements? How do we work together? And so all of this starts with these conversations. And that's really what we do at Impetus, is help to spearhead those courageous conversations. So check it out. Please like or subscribe to our channel so other people can find this information. We really appreciate your time, everybody. Thank you so much, Chad, for a great, intriguing conversation, and wishing everybody a great day ahead.